Hello and good evening, I'm Giles Gibson and you're watching Gravitas. The 19th of December was a night of terror as attackers struck in 3 different parts of the world. In Ankara, the Russian ambassador to Turkey was shot dead in full public view. Meanwhile, in Berlin, a lorry ploughed into a busy Christmas market, killing 12 and injuring many others. And finally, in Zurich, 3 men were wounded after a man stormed into an Islamic centre and opened fire on worshippers praying in the mosque. So 3 different incidents, seemingly unconnected, but what parallels can be drawn between all 3? Well, first up, let's take a look at the shocking attack in Ankara in Turkey, with the Russian ambassador to Turkey, Andrei Karlov, shot dead at a photograph exhibition. Here's a look at how it played out on the ground.
As far as terror attacks go, this was the least expected place where such an attack could take place. Russia's ambassador to Turkey was speaking at a photo exhibition when this happened. The assassin, 22-year-old Mevlut Mertaltintas, was an off-duty policer who worked in Ankara. The fact that he raised slogans in support of Syria and the people suffering in Aleppo and condemned Russia for the suffering brings into focus a disturbing fact. The war on the Islamic State and the accompanying human suffering is probably creating an entirely different problem for the world. The assassination comes at a time when relations between Russia and Turkey were improving. Both countries have agreed not to let this incident undermine their relations, but Russia has asked for more safety for its diplomats in Turkey. Russian President Vladimir Putin has understandably talked tough on continuing his fight against the Islamic State. He said, "This murder is clearly a provocation aimed at undermining the improvement and normalization of Russian-Turkish relations, as well as undermining the peace process in Syria promoted by Russia, Turkey, Iran and other countries interested in solving this conflict in Syria." Not much is known about the assassin, except that he was working for the riot police squad in Ankara. The Turkish government is accusing him of having connection with US-based Turkish preacher Fethullah Gülen's Hizmet movement. Bureau Report, WION.
All right, to discuss more on that attack in Ankara, I'm joined now by İlkin Kalisir, who's a journalist joining us from Istanbul in Turkey. And I'm also joined by Tahir Abbas, a senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, in London. Let's start with you, İlkin, first in Turkey. I just want to get a sense from you, who's being blamed for this attack within the Turkish media and Turkish politics?
In most of the Turkish media, Fethullah terror organization, so-called, is blamed for this attack. And there are some claimed proofs. I mean, some claim that there are proofs showing this, such as him being part of a prior investigation, etc. But these are not confirmed yet. For now, the FETA organization seems like the most likely culprit for most of the media, and allow me to say that this most of the media is content-wise quite well controlled by the government.
Right, so I want to go to you, Tahir, now in London. What do you make of that link to the Fethullah Gülen movement by the Turkish media, as İlkin was just telling us there?
The vast majority of the media is under the control of the government. All opposition silenced, and there's really no direct criticism of anything that the AKP says or does. And the idea that this can be pinned down on the Gülen movement is tenuous at best. There isn't any evidence. The fact that this individual concerned was part of a prior investigation only means that he was one of 100,000 or so people affected by the mass purges. That doesn't suggest anything at all, just that he was quite possibly swept up in all of that. So I think there are lots of issues there in Turkey around how issues are reported. And when it comes to Gülen movement, they are seemingly the sort of soft target for everything that goes wrong in Turkey at the moment.
Yes, and of course we saw them blamed by much of the Turkish media for that coup that we saw in the summer. If you say this link is tenuous, who are other sort of analysts around the world perhaps blaming this attack on?
Well, I mean, really, there isn't any pattern that can be drawn here. The usual two suspects are PKK or TAK, which is the more militant wing, or Islamic State. Islamic States have targeted tourist sites, areas that would affect the Turkish economy in the major parts of the country, and then PKK have targeted government installations and personnel, including police, etc., and buildings. Now, what does this reflect? Is a Russian ambassador at a cultural event. Chances are this was what they call a complete isolated lone actor whose motivations may have been just the images coming out of Aleppo over the weekend, which were deeply distressing to most people watching them. And it may well have tipped over somebody who was showing sympathies or may have been vulnerable as a result of mental illnesses or other sorts of trauma coming out of recent experiences.
Iken, I want to go back to you in Istanbul then. We've seen in the past attacks on police as sort of targets, especially by the PKK. How is the fact that this was carried out by a member of the authorities, a member of the riot police there in Ankara, playing out in Turkey?
That was quite a shock, I might say. But this was also, I mean, if you think a bit deeper, it's not that unexpected, actually. I mean, one should be able to expect this because everybody knew that there are some organizations within the police force which is not necessarily in line with the government policy. So they have their own agendas in a way. And this isn't just one movement, there are more than one. I would disagree with the other contributor about one point. That's he said if the link between the investigation, excuse me, this link between the investigation, the prior investigation, if it's unveiled, then it wouldn't change the fact, but it wasn't one of the mass purges who were made recently. In that case, I would very much agree with him. But this is an old case dating back to 2012. So it may be relevant. I'm not saying it's obviously it's not the right way to put the blame on somebody very quickly and get away with it. Of course, this must be investigated with all manners available. But if such links surface, then that means something. It's not just nothing. And also, I
just want to jump in there and give Tahir a chance to come back on that. Ekin there was disagreeing rather with one of your points. Do you want to come back on that?
Well, I think that's right. If there is a case history that goes back to a much earlier period, then it becomes of more interest. But then even then, it is just only that. A more relevant issue, we still don't know much about the individual. We know that his family were arrested. We know there have been held for questioning. But we don't know anything about the background in more detail beyond the fact that he might have been scooped up in some previous dating back to 2012. Who knows what's happened to the individual recently or over a longer term period to turn him into what he ultimately became last night.
And Tahir, would you agree that that link that we were talking about with the Turkish authorities, that it was perhaps not that unexpected that some style of the attack like this would come out of the Turkish police? Were you surprised to see that?
It is a surprise. We haven't seen anything like this before, as far as I can recall, and so therefore it does make it very unusual, irrespective of the person's background and the challenges they were facing, etc. This situation is certainly very new.
And what do you make of this impact? What do you think that's going to do to trust in the authorities, for example, within Turkey?
Well, I mean, because the police are now seemingly perfectly in the hands of the state, under the control of the party and the president, I think that the faith in the institutions of Turkish society have generally remained strong. And again, this is very much a blip. So it's really unclear as to which way things will fall immediately.
Iken, would you agree with that this is simply a blip on the trust in the Turkish authorities, or could this go quite deep, do you think?
I think it's already quite deep because we don't feel secure anymore. Security, I mean, I don't mean to scare anyone. I live in Istanbul and I'm on the street every day. So it's not that I'm running away from something, but there is a big security problem. I'm living in the center of the city, and in my 2-3 kilometer periphery, bombs I hear bombs exploding and gunfires going on. So, I mean, obviously this points to some sort of a problem within the police force, for example, within the Interior Ministry. There is some sort of a problem that hasn't been solved for quite a long time. And I don't know, in a normal democracy, we may say, you would expect some sort of a resign at some level, I don't know, at some responsible level. When something like this happens, when a police officer, for example, shoots an ambassador, something has gone terribly wrong there, I think.
Right, and Tahir, I want to bring you in on that point. Is this reflective, this attack, is this reflective of problems within Turkish society? Or many people will be saying that this is simply a spillover from the situation in Syria. Of course, as he carried out the attack, he shouted reportedly, "Don't forget Aleppo, don't forget Syria."
Well, it is undoubtedly the case that over the last 15 months or so, there have been 30+ suicide bombings or attacks on Turkey. That's dramatic. I think since June, July 2015, there's been a deep period of destabilization. And the failed coup, is deeply shocking for Turkish folk. I speak to colleagues and friends who are still reeling with a form of trauma. The events that night were still deeply affecting them. So there is that destabilization, but while there have been, there's also been this purging, this purging of all these people who have been kicked out of the police forces, the intelligence, security systems. That is obviously going to weaken the systems. It's going to weaken the ability of the police and security services to do their work. And so this individual has fallen through the net. He's managed to get access to the Russian ambassador and carried out this horrific act of terrorism. Because he was motivated by some individual personal psychological problem that he had. Who knows the extent or the depth of the problems as to whether this is reflective of the police services in general, or that it's something to do with a movement such as the Gülen movement, etc. So I see we need to separate the events from the individual, and how we understand those events from the particular individual experience. That's also relevant here.
All right, I'm going to ask you to both stay on the line. We're going to have a quick look at our reports now and an update from Istanbul on how this latest attack is affecting people within Turkey. Take a look.
In recent times, Russia and Turkey have had troubled political relationships, and the latest assassination of the Russian ambassador has once again raised the question of the political implications that this incident is going to have. Remember, this comes at a time when both Turkey and Russia are trying to protect their political agenda in Syria. Now, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was quick to issue a statement saying that this attack was a provocation of the Russian-Turkish ties. In fact, his Russian counterpart also echoed the same sentiment. But the bigger question is for the Turkish president on how he plans to handle the security crisis in Turkey that we face time and again. This is Srishti reporting for WION News from Istanbul.
And Tahir, we had our reporter there in Istanbul mentioning the role of Russia in this. How do you expect Turkish-Russian relations to develop in the wake of the attack? Of course, both sides are saying publicly that it's not going to let them affect the recent rapprochement that we've seen between them?
No, I don't think it will. I think they will continue to maintain improving relations on the back of the rapprochement after the failed coup. There has been a certain degree of increased engagement between them, and I think that's only going to continue. This was unprecedented. Obviously, it's a major issue, but I think the two countries will work hard to learn as best they can and take the appropriate action while maintaining their more forward-looking worldview.
Ikin, in Istanbul, would you agree with that statement?
Partly yes, and partly there's a bit more to it, because
what's that?
You wouldn't expect Turkey and Russia go into a war over such an issue. So, of course, Turkey and Russia are going to, because they're we're neighbors and we're not going anywhere. Turkey is not moving anywhere. Russia is not moving anywhere. And we have such a history that we always found a solution for some thousands of years in the history of our diplomacy and very old relations. So it boils down to the point. This is some sort of a who's going to have an upper hand situation. In one way, we can say this, and in the other way, in the bigger game, who's going to have the power? I mean, is it going to be which country will be more powerful over this region? Is it going to be Russia? Is it going to be United States? Is it going to be United Kingdom? Is it going to be France? So this is about something else. What's going to happen after this? Of course, Turkey and Russia will find a way to make peace, but at which level?
All right, Ikin, thank you very much for your update. Ikin Kalisir, a journalist from Istanbul. Thank you very much for your input. And I'm going to ask Tahir Abbas, a senior research fellow from RUSI, to stay on the line, because after a quick break, we're going to be discussing a terror attack that occurred in Jordan. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gravitas. We're going to stay in the Middle Eastern region now, and at least 10 people, including one foreign tourist, were killed in an attack by armed gunmen in Jordan on Sunday. The country is part of the US-led coalition fighting the Islamic State in neighbouring Syria and has often been threatened by the group. So far, nobody has claimed responsibility, though, for this latest attack. Here's more on that story.
It began as an attack on policemen. But Sunday's standoff in the southern Jordanian city of Karak with 4 terrorists ended with 10 dead, including 1 Canadian tourist. The Islamic State has claimed responsibility. A suicide car bomb attack some months ago on the Jordan-Syrian border had also been executed by IS terrorists. The Islamic State recently threatened to break down Jordan's borders. Jordan has much in common with Lebanon, Syria and Egypt. Jordan and Egypt have signed peace treaties and trade agreements with Israel. Lebanon and Syria have not. And yet the last war between Israel and Syria was way back in 1981, while Israel and Lebanon were last locked in battle in 1983. Israel and Syria trade apples, river water, pilgrims, and even bride and bridegrooms. Israeli goods frequently turn up in Lebanon as end products of Israel's trade with hostile Arab countries. In other words, apart from minor skirmishes, peace has reigned along Israel's border with all 4 Arab countries for over 3 decades. More recently, Syrian citizens caught in the crossfire between the US and Russia-led factions in the war against Islamic State raging in Syria found unlikely support among protesting citizen groups in Israel. Jordan backs the US-led war against ISIS. If it is now the Islamic State's new soft target in the Mediterranean rim of the Middle East, yesterday's attack may well signify the beginning of the end of the unlikeliest and longest spell of peace in the world that along the borders of the pan-Israel region. Bureau Report, WION.
All right, let's continue our discussion now, and I'm still joined by Tahir Abbas, a senior research fellow of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute in London. Tahir, thanks very much for staying with us. Let's get your analysis on this attack in Jordan now. Is this sort of blowback for Jordan for being part of that US-led coalition in Syria, do you think?
It would seem that way. It would seem that the Islamic State have targeted Jordan because of their involvement in the forces that have coalesced to fight them in those territories, which is very unusual. And it's unusual because they've targeted Jordan, which has been left relatively untouched, as mentioned in the earlier report, for a very long time.
Sure, it's been left untouched by the violence in Syria for a long time, as you say. Can you see Jordan being kind of pulled into that crisis in Syria, like we're seeing in Turkey, for example, violence generally spreading around the region?
And there's always the risk of that, but I think the situation with Jordan is that the Israel as a neighbor is it's in a very strategic position, and I think the Israelis would work hard to try and prevent anything from infiltrating their own patch in that part of the Middle East. So I think Israel's position and the fact that if the international community were to allow Islamic State to take a firmer foothold in Jordan, it would be very destabilizing for the region.
You say a firmer foothold in Jordan. What's their kind of position there at the moment, would you say? How would you characterize it?
Well, I think they're generally open in the sense that there are shared engagements in relation to research analysis with regards to counterterrorism and violent extremism. I know that there's an understanding that's definitely been taken up by countries across the Middle East. So there's shared learning and shared regional best practice thinking. So I think Jordan has always been involved in those discussions in the case of a situation like this arising. So I think they're well prepared, and a relatively small country. If this does flare up and become a much more severe problem for Jordan, I think the international community are going to be keeping a very close eye.
And of course, the international community have been critical of some states in the region, some of the Gulf states and Israel, for not being sort of practically involved in some ways in the Syrian conflict. Do you think this attack on Jordan is going to cue up perhaps more involvement from the Gulf nations, from Israel? What do you think about that?
I don't think I can say too much about that. I wouldn't. I think the situation is deeply fragile in Iraq and Syria, and I think that while there are many proxy wars going on there with different interests, regional and global, and it's a very murky fog of war there. I don't think escalation is in anybody's interests, apart from the Islamic State, who in their period of disintegration are trying to flare up hotspots across the world and back into Europe. If the Berlin attack is what we might suspect it to be, then I think this is all about the failure and the breakdown of Islamic State. But the consequences of that are still yet to be fully appreciated, because there will be many severe consequences.
All right, so we're going to have to leave it there. But Tahir Abbas, a senior research fellow from RUSI in London, thanks very much to joining us to discuss the situation in Turkey as well as in Jordan. We're going to take a quick break now, but when we come back, we'll be discussing that horrific attack on a Christmas market in Berlin. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. You're watching Gravitas. After yesterday's terror attack in Berlin, in which a truck killed 12 people and injured at least 50 others, Christmas markets across Europe are seeing unprecedented security. Investigations are underway, and the suspect, reportedly a 23-year-old refugee from Pakistan, is being interrogated as we speak. Well, here's more on that story and that attack in that Christmas market in Berlin.
A centuries-old tradition and one of Germany's best loved. The country's Christkindlmärkte, or Christmas markets, are favourite venues to gather over sausages, mulled wine and traditional Christmas goodies at the end of another long year. Just like the one at Berlin's Breitscheidplatz in the heart of the German capital yesterday. There was a sound of laughter, sizzling oil and music till terror struck. a trailer truck veered straight into the crowds of shoppers and revelers, killing 10 persons and injuring at least 50 others grievously. The fragrance of candied almonds was quickly and tragically replaced by the stench of death and the music by shocked silence.
I was standing at the entrance of the Christmas market and then I heard a loud noise and was knocked down by a collapsing market stand. It knocked me flat to the ground. It was only later that I realized that there were many people on the ground who did not move.
The attack was a rare one in the country that has taken on the maximum number of refugees fleeing the war in Syria. But it was by no means the first of its kind in Europe. It was only in July that a Tunisian-born man had driven a 19-ton truck into a crowd of people at a beachfront in France, killing 86 persons. That attack, as yesterday's, was claimed by the Islamic State. The attack at Breitscheidplatz is expected to escalate criticism of German Chancellor Angela Merkel's refugee policy, since many Germans fear that Islamic State terrorists will have also entered the country on the pretext of escaping the war themselves. It will also likely improve the chances of the far-right Alternative für Deutschland, which is already represented in 10 regional parliaments, at entering the national one next year.
Noch wissen wir vieles über diese Tat.
There is much we still do not know with sufficient certainty, but we must, as things stand now, assume it was a terrorist attack. I know it would be especially hard for us all to bear if it were confirmed that the person who committed this act was someone who sought protection and asylum in Germany. This would be especially despicable for the many, many Germans who day in and day out are actively working for refugees, as well as for those people who actually need our protection and who make an effort to integrate into our country.
Flags were flown at half-mast across Germany. Investigations have begun. But the German police, who initially said that the suspect is a 23-year-old refugee from Pakistan, now doubt whether they arrested the real terrorist at the wheel of the truck yesterday. But last night's tragic event, just a week away from Christmas, will cast a pall of gloom over the festival, both for the grieving families of the victims, but also for millions of Germans across the country. And a pall of fear, for if the arrested man is the wrong one, the real armed killer is still on the loose. Bureau Report, WION.
All right, for more on that attack in Berlin, I'm joined now by Nikita Malik, who's a senior researcher at the Quilliam-based NGO in London. Nikita, thanks very much for joining us this evening. I just want to get your thoughts first up on the symbolism of an attack on a Christmas market, a Christmas tradition like that. What do you make of the symbolism of this attack?
Well, last week, a young child, he's 12 years old, there were 2 attacks that he was trying to do in a market as well in Germany, and the German authorities arrested him last week. And this week we see an attack in a Christmas market as well. It's actually a very common use to target large crowds, like has been done today, in order to gain maximum impact. And of course, in a Christmas market, what a terrorist would be hoping for would be that the people attending the Christmas market are not Muslims, and therefore they are killing the largest amount of disbelievers, but also having the most impact in the media in order to show that this has happened because of the large crowds present there.
And I just want to get your thoughts. The Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland party's main spokeswoman said after the attack, she said the Christmas market was not an accidental target. It's not only an attack on our freedom and our way of life, but on our Christian tradition. Do you think that's oversimplifying the issue to say that this is an attack by Islam on Christianity?
Yes, I think it would be a bit of an oversimplification, though it is exactly rhetoric like this that Islamist extremist organizations capitalize on, because what we're seeing is a binary worldview. You have Islam versus Christianity, but of course what we see on a day-to-day basis and what Merkel has touched on is the actual integration and inclusion of refugees in Germany, which has previously been extremely successful and I hope continues to be, actually shows that this is not the case. You have Muslims living very peacefully in European countries who have integrated. And what an attack like this does is it polarizes an entire community. Now, what we have with the refugee community that is particularly alarming to me is that, in fact, this 23-year-old Pakistani asylum seeker, illegal or legal, who was arrested today, is in fact not the person who committed the attack. But of course, people will capitalize on this and say, look at this refugee, look at how ungrateful he is. We have let in a terrorist, and begin to suspect other refugee communities who are in fact fleeing these terrorists in Syria and Iraq to try to get asylum because they're fleeing a war zone and they're fleeing conflict there. So I think simplifying it to such a binary worldview, black and white, is extremely dangerous, and it misses the actual picture here.
And we also saw Donald Trump, the president-elect of the United States, weighing in on this attack. He said that this attack represents a slaughter of Christians in their communities and places of worship. Do you think that's an oversimplification once again?
Yes, I mean, of course there are Christians who have been affected. This is a religious holiday, but let us also remember that a few days ago there was an attack in Jordan, in Karak, where Sunni Muslims were killed, and that was because, and that was also claimed by Islamic State, and it was seen as an attack on Jordan. And so we cannot just simplify it to religion. Of course, there's politics at play here. There's an issue of power at play here. And just to have it as one religion against another misses many nuances in this debate. So, and by polarizing it, of course, the people who are punished the most are communities of Muslims who are living in these areas, who might have nothing to do with, they absolutely have nothing to do with the attack and they don't agree with it. But we see an increase of far-right hatred against them, and that becomes extremely risky and dangerous.
And of course, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, she's also been weighing in. She's spoken earlier saying that it's particularly sickening if the suspect is proven to be a refugee. As you say, this 23-year-old Pakistani asylum seeker, it's not clear if police have got the right man or not at this stage. Do you think that's slightly dangerous rhetoric coming from the German Chancellor there, saying sickening?
I think she's in a bit of a difficult position because of the increase of far-right rhetoric that is happening in Europe. And it is seen as incredibly appealing and actually a convenient way to blame an entire community of migrants who are actually escaping violence and who are escaping these extremist organizations. And what we begin to see is, through a use of rhetoric like this, violence against refugee communities increases. And a lot of the basis of Islamist extremist groups such as Islamic State is to say that if you leave the caliphate, if you escape, you will be punished and you will have violence against you. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy on both sides, and you get these mutually reinforcing cycles of hatred and division. So what we have to focus on here is inclusion. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that youth who was arrested last week is a German youth. Yes, he was of Iraqi descent, but he's German and he's 12 years old. So obviously there's a network of terrorists at play here who are able to capitalize on young and vulnerable people. So we have to focus on resilience of young and vulnerable people against extremism rather than communities.
All right, so I'm going to ask you, Nikita, to stay on the line because we're now joined by Ira Spitzer, who's the Berlin Bureau Chief for Feature Story News. Ira, thanks very much for joining us this evening. I just want to get your latest updates on this confusion, really. Earlier on, the German authorities seem to indicate that this 23-year-old Pakistani asylum seeker was the right man, the right suspect, but they're sort of pulling back now. What's the latest on that?
Well, there's been a series of developments here in Berlin throughout the day. Of course, the day began with the Berlin police saying that they believe that this indeed was an intentional act and treating it as an act of terror. And then also we heard the news, as you just mentioned, of the 23-year-old Pakistani asylum seeker being apprehended. Now then, just a couple hours after that, the police said that actually they were not 100% sure that the person in custody necessarily had something to do with this attack. There were initially language issues. The person said he denied any sort of connection to the attack, and apparently police have rolled back some of those initial claims and have also cast some doubt. Now, we still don't know whether there could be perhaps more accomplices involved. That is also something that they brought up in a news conference. So a fair amount of confusion here in Berlin. However, the authorities here are definitely have taken an approach that they will err on the side of caution. So if they are not completely certain that they have the right person, they are going to treat it as an active crime scene. But at the same time, we saw memorials being held here in Berlin at the site of the attack, attended by the chancellor as well as some of her cabinet ministers. So it's unclear right now whether there still is a suspect at large, but we do expect to get more information from the authorities in the coming hours.
And Ira, can you just give us a sense of the atmosphere there in Berlin as we speak, almost 24 hours coming up now after that attack?
Well, the city, as you can imagine, has been in a state of shock and despair for the entire day. Just a shocking act, something that, well, Germans may have anticipated potentially being a target of some of the types of attacks that we've seen in neighboring countries. The fact that it seems to have actually happened really has had a tremendous effect on people's psyches here as they try and come to grips with the issue of personal safety and the safety of loved ones. And when you look at the target of this attack, a Christmas market is an essential part of the German holiday celebration. This is a place where families come together, friends meet, people eat, they drink, they shop for Christmas presents. It is not a place associated with the kind of fear or uncertainty of a terror attack. So for the Christmas market, one of the most famous ones in Berlin and in the whole country, to be targeted really has shaken Germany to its core. And when there was that initial report of an asylum seeker being the suspect, that immediately started off the debate here that has been ongoing for the last year and even longer about the high number of asylum seekers in Germany and whether the country is really safe. So that debate has been reignited. Some people are skeptical that about the Chancellor Angela Merkel's asylum policies and are questioning those right now.
All right, Ira Spitzer, thank you very much. Berlin Bureau Chief for Feature Story News there. Thanks very much for that update from the German capital. All right, we're not exactly sure. Clearly, authorities are still looking into the motivations for the attack, but the Islamic State is causing devastation in the Middle East and has also inspired violence in other parts of the world. This next report looks at the role the group plays in terror across the globe.
The temptation to see the hand of the Islamic State in the killing in Turkey and the attack on Christmas shoppers in Berlin can be easy to give into. It becomes even more easier when the Islamic State claims credit for various attacks, even if it had little to do with them.
The Islamic State used terrorist attacks to regenerate its image all over the world. These attacks serve the purpose for them to show that they are everywhere and that they are powerful. And this is why they often claim also attacks that they actually have not organized. So we have to be very careful in declaring that the Islamic State is behind attacks, because a mistake could actually help their propaganda and help their ideology to spread all over the world.
But it cannot be denied that the movement has inspired people all over the world, usually through the internet. Some have been motivated enough to travel to the so-called caliphate in Raqqa and enlist as fighters. Others have preferred to remain in their home countries, operating undercover, relying on a small group similarly inspired to convert others to their cause and plot attacks on various targets.
Behind the attack of the Islamic State, or the supposed attacks of the Islamic State, there is not always a fully aware choice. The ideology of the caliphate has a certain appeal to elements of a society who feel isolated or marginalized and who can decide by themselves to pick up the heinous actions that the Islamic State conducts everywhere in the world as an example and to perpetrate their own attacks.
In Syria, with Aleppo now more or less in Syrian government's hands, it's a matter of time before Islamists in other parts of the country feel the heat. Raqqa could fall before long, but the ideas and ideology of the Islamic State will live on. Bureau Report, WION.
All right, we're going to take a quick break now, but stay with us for more analysis when we come back. Welcome back to Gravitas. We're going to continue our discussion here, and I'm still joined by Nikita Malik, a senior researcher from WION, and I'm also being joined now by Arun Vishwanath, an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Buffalo. Thanks very much for both staying with me. We've been discussing this series of attacks that we saw across Europe and Turkey as well last night. When ISIS is linked to these attacks, I'll go to you, Arun, first up. When ISIS is linked to these attacks, do you think that changes the conversation in terms of how these attacks are viewed, rather than a lone wolf attack in the US, for example?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it plays right into the narratives of the... I mean, there is a political component to this and a political consequence to each and every one of these attacks. So even if this is a lone wolf, and it very well could be, and many of these tend to be, they're disaggregated in many ways. But if you have an umbrella organization quickly accepting ownership of them, it plays into the narratives of the far right in every one of these countries. And the narrative changes completely. And so this is clearly going to be problematic moving forward.
And Nikita, would you agree with that sentiment that ISIS sort of claiming these attacks, which are largely, we don't know who's behind these two latest attacks, but other attacks we've seen across Europe in this sort of style have been by lone wolf young men, perhaps sort of disadvantaged young men. Do you think ISIS claiming it sort of changes the conversation there and really gets away from the facts of the issue?
I don't think so, because for the last year, WION has been warning of a global jihadist insurgency. And by that we mean we will increasingly start to see these lone wolf attacks. And we have players on the internet, including Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, who are able to go online and quickly claim any lone wolf attack without actually having to have invested any time in training, in ideological indoctrination. All it requires really is to download a manual from the internet to teach you how to stuff a backpack with nails and go into a crowded market. So these young people, these young men, this generation of young, angry men are beginning to find the content that they need online. Unlike the Taliban in Afghanistan, where they would have actually had to physically go and do training and be involved in camps, their level of indoctrination is much faster. And so, of course, our approach needs to be different. We need to engage more with private sector actors such as Google, Twitter, Facebook on the internet to monitor this content, because it is freely available for those who want to go and find it.
But if these attacks are being inspired by ISIS, clearly the root problem of this is that these men are finding themselves sort of, with no actual sort of options in life. Is that the root of the problem, rather than the consequences which then occur afterwards?
Yes, I think the root of the problem is something that needs to be heavily studied more, because there's no conveyor belt theory of jihadism. So what radicalizes an individual, what causes them to go and commit an act of violence can be very different, whether it is an asylum seeker who is fed up of political exhaustion and the failure of institutions to support them, or it's a German-born citizen, or in the case of Russia, a policeman. I mean, these people are all coming from very different backgrounds. And so we really do need to invest in analyzing what radicalizes an individual more, and similarly, what builds resilience amongst these communities for all of those refugees, for all of those young men who have moved to these countries and who have not radicalized and who do not believe in violence. What is it that we need to understand about those cases so that we can replicate those cases and stop these attacks happening again and again?
And Arun, I want to go to you at the University of Buffalo. Right-wing groups in Europe, after reacting to these types of attacks, they'll say that this is a spillover. This is something being brought into the countries. Would you agree that it's actually something that's sort of deep inside the societies themselves?
Well, this plays into the narrative of every one of these societies. What we've been seeing in the last 5 to 7 years is we're seeing refugees. We have a crisis in the Middle East. We have a spillover of that all over Europe, and even to the United States, even to North America right now. And we have groups within every one of these nations that are now pushing back. Attacks of this form play right into that narrative. It's a narrative that's very parochial, and it's understandable to some extent. And I don't believe that the solution to this is more monitoring alone. The solution, paradoxically, is more openness. So in other words, it's one thing to say we got to monitor them more, and I work with many agencies that actually do that, but monitoring alone, we know what they're doing. The point here is to counter it, and to counter it with more positive messages using the same formats, that these individuals are already using. ISIS is a very, very sophisticated propaganda machinery out there. And this is basically what we're seeing is terrorism 2.0. This is crowdsourced terrorism. You may call it terrorism, you may call it fundamentalism, you may call it, there might not be a uniting thread, but there might very well be a thread, which is the internet, that connects a lot of these people in how they get radicalized. And so the solution is not just to monitor them. Yeah, we do need to monitor them, but we have been doing that. We know what they're doing. The solution is more openness. The solution is not to close our borders either. It's to actually make them much more open and to integrate these individuals into society much faster. Maybe that's where the core of the problem is. And that's just one of the solutions. But you know, this is a larger discussion that we really need to get serious about.
All right, I'm going to thank both of you very much for your input on this conversation. Nikita Malik, Senior Researcher from Quilliam, as well as Arun Vishwanath, an Associate Professor at the Department of Communication at the University of Buffalo. Thank you very much for both of your input tonight, and that's all from Gravitas here. But tune in same time tomorrow for more in-depth analysis of the day's major issues. Thanks for watching.